After Star Wars debuted in 1977 and made obscene amounts of money, everybody wanted a slice of that space opera pie. Disney took their shot in 1979 with The Black Hole, featuring a distinctive visual style and some curious casting choices. But this one is more than just a cheap Star Wars knockoff. Sure, it has its share of obnoxious kid-friendly robots and action sequences that look suspiciously like theme park rides, a supremely irritating score. But I've always wanted to remake this movie, not as G-rated pulp sci-fi, but as a horror thriller. Because when you get underneath all the cheese, this film is kind of dark. We begin with the crew of the USS Palomino. They've picked up a transmission that turns out to be a long-lost starship, the Cygnus, built many years before at great expense and sent out on a mission to find habitable worlds. At some point, the mission was arbitrarily decided to have failed, and the Cygnus was recalled. At which point, the Cygnus just completely ghosted them. And no one bothered going out to look for them. Tax write-off, I guess, whatever. After the crew of the Palomino damages their ship, giving us a master class in things black holes don't do, they decide to dock with the freshly illuminated Cygnus to poke around and maybe make some repairs to their ship. This sequence is a bit dull by modern standards, but thankfully it does spare us the usual unfunny banter and obnoxious jump scares. What it does do is show us around the Cygnus, which has a distinctive and somehow disturbing visual style. There's a lot of suspension cables and cavernous spaces, and slightly off angles that make the Cygnus seem just subtly creepy in a way that the Event Horizon wasn't. After wandering around for a bit, they take a tram to the bridge where they meet Dr. Hans Reinhardt, who puts them at ease as only a German in a lab coat can. And this bridge, seriously, it's like Skeksis decorated the Death Star. Strange things are afoot in the aerospace industry, it would seem. Dr. Reinhardt gives them a completely credible story about meteor showers and the crew abandoning ship in deep space and all dying, forcing him to build this crew of robot monks to man the light bright stations.
They look a bit medieval, but I'm a romantic.
But of course our intrepid captain and the troublesome reporter go snooping around and uncover to their horror that the robot clergy are in fact the original crew who have had their souls sucked out by some weird ray claw thing. Whatever, it makes a lot more sense than the Star Wars knockoffs Disney makes these days. You see, Hans Reinhardt has a vision. The Cygnus is a microcosm of an authoritarian state. Top-down, collectivist, soul-crushing, and anti-human. For context, we need to consider when this film was made. In 1979, America was not at its best. Inflation was out of control, there was a fuel crisis, the economy was absolute shite, the country had lost international respect after a humiliating failure in the Middle East, and we were very miffed with the Russians for invading one of their neighbors. Unlike Star Trek in the 60s, American sci-fi of the 70s tended to be less optimistic and more focused on themes of militarism. The Galactic Empire of Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica's Cylons are tyrannies that span across the stars. But in the Black Hole, the theme of oppression and collectivism is condensed down to this tiny group of people aboard a single ship. Reinhardt is a dictator archetype. He has a plan for a better future, and he is absolutely confident in his own genius. And because of that perceived superiority, he demands absolute obedience and loyalty from those under his authority, to the point of dehumanizing them, in this case quite literally.
I'm about to prove to you that the end justifies the means.
But simply having the power and fulfilling his vision isn't enough. He needs to have his genius recognized.
These are all my formulas I've compiled over the years. I want you to take them back with you and pass them on to others in case something might happen to me.
It doesn't matter if the genius plan is actually completely insane, in this case, flying into a black hole to possess the secrets of the universe and immortality or some crazy shite like that. The Stalins, Hitlers, and Maos of the world don't spend a lot of time picking apart their grand plans and wondering if they're making a mistake with all the enslaving and murdering. The transcendent state needs more than obedience. It requires adulation, and it requires sacrifices. The black hole cuts to the core of how dictators seize and maintain power. Reinhardt wasn't some wild-eyed revolutionary. It was his mission. He was involved in the design of the Cygnus and the planning of the mission. He was given the authority over it by the duly constituted civil government at the time. The crew signed on with him in charge of the expedition. Dr. Reinhardt has far more in common with a military officer or an elected politician than he does with a Bond villain. But when the Cygnus is out on its own, when that recall order comes, that's when things begin to change very quickly. At this point, he starts turning the crew into meat robots with shady space magic. Laying the pod with a tinfoil hat on, some sounds and flashing lights happen, and from that day on, you are a faceless minion.
Without their wheels, the crew became things he could command.
Rather than technology serving people, the people are made to serve the technology. The metaphor of people being turned into cogs in a vast machine is disturbingly familiar. Over the course of the last century, millions of people were slaughtered in the service of various dictators with grand visions. But of course, Reinhardt is just one man. He can't individually wrestle each member of the crew down into the soul-sucker bed. He needs two things to make it work: an organized force of minions to carry out his orders, and a lack of organization on the part of his victims. We're left to surmise the details, and this is where my dark and horrific remake comes in. It's the classic problem of resisting a tyrant. The crew greatly outnumbers the security robots, but nobody wants to be in the first line of a charge that'll be cut down. It's hard for people to believe that people that they've trained with and worked alongside, considered friends, are now trying to subjugate them, imprison them, enslave them. It can't happen here, they say, as it's happening all around them. Some of them probably tried to reason with Reinhardt, tried to find a compromise, maybe even rationalize that it might be happening to other members of the crew, but it won't happen to me. I'm too important. But in the end, they were all turned into robed button punchers by unthinking machines that obeyed orders and hauled them to the brain scrambler beds. Why then, when the crew of the Palomino arrives, are they not immediately killed and disposed of? Instead, they're wined and dined like honored guests. Because Reinhardt has everything he needs, except the adulation that he craves. And these 5 people, the crew of the Palomino, become embroiled in the web of treachery and oppression that is Reinhardt's regime. Dr. Durant, played by Anthony Perkins, becomes enamored with the man and his accomplishments. He's like the American and British intellectuals that praise Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union even after visiting them, brushing off the horrors that they didn't want to see because their vision of what could be was so bright that the glare blinded them to what truly was. The reporter Harry Booth, played by Ernest Borgnine, captures that combination of suspicion, skepticism, and cowardice that is so common in oppressive regimes. He doesn't trust Reinhardt. He knows that he's being lied to. But when the time to resist presents itself, he's afraid. He panics. And panic never helps.
Blow it apart before it hits us! Fire!
Ultimately, Reinhardt's mad vision leads to the destruction of the Cygnus and taking his people straight to hell. Yeah, they lay it on pretty thick with an extra side of cheese. But the 3 survivors of the Palomino make it through the hole, which in a way is the film's final dark note. While Star Wars is a story about defeating evil, the black hole is a story about merely escaping it. There's no way to overthrow Reinhardt. His machines are too loyal and well-armed. The regime is too stable. There's no saving the crew. The damage is permanent. They can never come back from what was done to them.
The damage is irreversible. Death is their only release.
the only hope is to flee, and even that requires faith in Reinhardt's vision. Faith that he wasn't completely mad.
To Reinhardt's course. You mean we're going into the black hole? Yep.
Let's pray he was a genius.
This is a story where evil isn't just a passing darkness. It leaves a permanent legacy. It destroys almost all of those it touches and permanently scars those few who escape. After everything that happened on the Cygnus, these 3 survivors can never go back to the world they knew. They're in a new world now with new challenges that they have to face on their own. And even if they're able to make a paradise of it, they can never completely escape that it began with mass death. So, are there any old juggalos out there that remember this one?
Mr. Pizer, I think you should come up here.